The colonization of Helios 7 was supposed to be humanity's perfect frontier settlement. Nestled in the Orion Arm, the planet boasted terraformed grasslands that stretched between jagged mountain ranges, dotted with research outposts and small agricultural communities. Settlers had spent decades transforming the once hostile world into a beacon of human perseverance, a testament to their ability to create life where nothing had existed before. Commander Elena Rodriguez watched from the central observation tower as her daughter Aria played with friends near the community greenhouse. The morning light caught the transparent biodomes, casting prismatic reflections across the settlement. Aria, her 12-year-old daughter, moved with a dancer's grace, her hands animatedly explaining something to her friends, probably another one of her complex coding theories that most adults struggle to comprehend. The first warning came as a subtle vibration. Most would have missed it. A microsecond pulse that rippled through the ground, causing dust motes to dance and small creatures to freeze. But Elena wasn't most people. Her years of military training and planetary defense coordination made her hypersensitive to anomalies. Trajectory scan now. She barked into her communication implant. The settlement's AI responded instantaneously, its holographic interface materializing beside her. Translucent data streams revealed what human eyes could not. Massive energy signatures approaching from the upper atmosphere. The signatures didn't match any known human or allied spacecraft configurations. Zorn Collective, Elena whispered, a chill running down her spine. The Zorn were notorious, a militaristic species that viewed other civilizations as resource pools. They didn't negotiate, they harvested. Entire planetary populations had vanished under their systematic extraction protocols. Helios 7 was supposed to be too far from their known territories, too insignificant to attract their attention. Apparently, someone had been wrong. Massive gravitational displacement fields began to form overhead. The sky itself seemed to tear, revealing metallic structures that defied conventional physics. Sleek, obsidian-like ships with razor-sharp geometries materialized, their surfaces absorbing light like living shadows. Evacuation Protocol Omega, Elena shouted, her voice cutting through the sudden silence. Colonists moved with practiced efficiency. Years of training kicked in. Children were herded into reinforced shelters. Emergency supplies were grabbed, defensive systems primed. But the Zorn's technology was generations beyond human capabilities. Electromagnetic pulses cascaded across the settlement. Defensive systems collapsed like paper structures. Communication networks dissolved into static. Within moments, the colony's sophisticated technological infrastructure became nothing more than expensive decoration. Aria and her friends found themselves suddenly isolated. The greenhouse's environmental controls flickered and died, leaving them exposed and vulnerable. Children who moments ago were discussing quantum computing and xenobotanical research now faced an incomprehensible threat. Kai Wong, a 13-year-old whose parents ran the settlement's survival training program, immediately took charge. "Stay together," he instructed, his voice calm despite the chaos. "Create a defensive perimeter. Use what you know." The Zorn boarding parties moved with liquid precision. Their exosuits looked less like traditional armor and more like living metal, shifting and adapting with each movement. Gravitational manipulation allowed them to move between spaces that should have been solid, rendering traditional cover meaningless. Elena realized with growing horror that conventional resistance was futile. The Zorn weren't here for resources or territory. They were collecting something specific: children. Technological abductions have been rumored for years. Whispered stories about alien civilizations seeking young minds with adaptive capabilities. Most had dismissed these as conspiracy theories. Now those theories were becoming terrifyingly real. As massive gravitational tethers began isolating groups of children, Elena made a final desperate transmission. Not a call for help. Those would never penetrate the Zorn's communication jamming, but a message encoded into her daughter's personal quantum communication chip. "Remember everything," the message read. "Use what we taught you. Arya caught her mother's eye across the rapidly dissolving scene. No fear showed in her expression. Only a cold, calculating focus that suggested the Zorn had no idea what they were about to encounter. The abduction took less than 17 minutes. When orbital surveillance systems finally reactivated, Helios 7 looked like it had been abandoned mid-breath. A frozen moment of disruption, with only scattered personal effects suggesting anything had happened at all. 6 children taken, a colony silent, and the Zorn would soon learn that they had made a terrible mistake. The Zorn containment chamber was a marvel of xenobiological engineering, a space designed to neutralize and categorize potential biological threats. Crystalline walls pulsed with adaptive metamaterials that could instantly reconfigure based on the occupants' physiological and psychological responses. Sensors embedded in every surface collected data at quantum-level resolution, tracking everything from cellular metabolism to neural activity. What the Zorn failed to understand was that human children were not typical specimens. Arya Martinez closed her eyes, feeling the microscopic vibrations of the chamber. Each pulse of the walls carried information, data streams that most would perceive as meaningless background noise. To her, it was a complex language waiting to be decoded. "We're being studied," she murmured to Kaiwang, who was systematically examining the chamber's physical structure, not just monitored. "They're running comprehensive behavioral algorithms." Kay's fingers traced a nearly invisible seam where the wall met the floor. Survival training wasn't just about wilderness skills. It was about understanding environments as complex systems. "Every containment has a weakness," he responded, his voice low. "We just need to find the right lever." Nearby, Alina Petrova had already disassembled a small communication device they'd been given, ostensibly for comfort, but clearly a monitoring tool. Her fingers moved with surgical precision, mapping out the alien technology's internal architecture. Each component told a story of engineering philosophy fundamentally different from human design. Marcus Johnson sat in the corner, a holographic chessboard hovering before him. But this wasn't a game of traditional strategy. He was mapping their situation, each piece representing a potential action, each move a calculated risk. The Zorn thought they were studying the children. Marcus was studying them back. Lena Al-Faisal watched the group dynamics with a clinical eye. She'd been observing the Zorn guards, their communication patterns, the subtle hierarchical tensions that leaked through their supposedly perfect collective consciousness. Body language was a universal language, and the Zorn were far from perfect at hiding their internal conflicts. Diego Ramirez seemed the most relaxed, which immediately made him the most dangerous. A deck of worn playing cards danced between his fingers, not playing, but practicing. Each movement was a calculation, each shuffle a potential distraction waiting to be deployed. The chamber's environmental controls began to subtly shift. Most would miss the microscopic changes, temperature fluctuations of mere fractions of a degree, oxygen content varying by imperceptible margins. But these children were anything but most people. "They're running a baseline test," Arya explained, her eyes still closed, "trying to establish our physiological stress responses." Kai nodded. "So we give them exactly what they expect, but not what they understand." What followed was a masterclass in psychological misdirection. Each child began to perform precisely calculated responses, elevated heart rates that followed predictable patterns, stress indicators that matched textbook human reactions. But beneath the surface, they were gathering intelligence, building a comprehensive understanding of their captors. Alina's technical analysis revealed the first true vulnerability. The Zorn's adaptive technology relied on a fundamental assumption that biological systems followed predictable patterns. Their entire technological paradigm was built on the concept of categorization and control. Humans, especially children, were masters of unpredictability. Marcus began to introduce deliberately complex mathematical patterns into their involuntary responses, brainwave fluctuations that followed prime number sequences, stress responses that defied standard deviation models. To the Zorn sensors, it would look like data corruption. To Marcus, it was a form of mathematical resistance. Lena took a different approach. She identified the psychological profiling algorithms being used and began to feed them contradictory information. A subject showing simultaneously high creativity and rigid logic, extreme adaptability coupled with deep emotional stability, psychological models that couldn't be easily categorized. Diego's contribution was perhaps the most subtle. Small physical manipulations, a twitch here, a micro-expression there, that would cause the monitoring systems to constantly recalibrate. Each adjustment was a magic trick, turning the Zorn's own surveillance into a hall of mirrors. Kai continued his physical investigation, finding microscopic inconsistencies in the chamber's design. Not to escape, not yet, but to understand. Every containment system had a philosophy, and philosophy could be exploited. Aria's fingers danced across an invisible interface, capturing and analyzing the data streams. What the Zorn saw as a containment chamber, she was transforming into the most sophisticated research platform they'd ever encountered. The children weren't prisoners. They were researchers. And their subject was about to become very interesting. Sub-Commander Vexnar's neural interface began to malfunction during the standard post-capture assessment. The holographic displays flickered with increasing frequency, diagnostic subroutines spinning into cascading errors that defied logical explanation. What appeared to be random system failures were anything but random. In the primary observation chamber, Senior Administrator Kralix studied the human children with mounting unease. The initial categorization protocols had failed spectacularly. Standard cynobiological assessment matrices crumbled when applied to these 6 young specimens. Their physiological and psychological responses existed in a state of quantum uncertainty, simultaneously predictable and utterly incomprehensible. Diego Ramirez was the first to weaponize boredom. His seemingly idle card tricks became a sophisticated form of technological warfare. Each shuffle introduced microscopic electromagnetic disruptions. A deck of cards transformed into a precision instrument of chaos. When a Zorn technician approached to collect biological samples, Diego's fingers moved in a pattern that looked like a simple flourish. In reality, he was systematically mapping the technician's personal communication frequency. Lena Alfazel observed the ship's social dynamics with the precision of a cultural anthropologist. The Zorn collective prided itself on absolute unity, a collective consciousness that supposedly eliminated individual variation. But she saw the cracks. Hierarchical tensions, unspoken rivalries, subtle power struggles masked by a veneer of technological perfection, a communication officer's subtle eye movement, the microsecond hesitation before a response, the imperceptible tension in a joint command structure. These were the pressure points Lena began to exploit. In the ship's central navigation systems, Aria Martinez was conducting a different kind of invasion. Her understanding of complex systems went beyond traditional hacking. She was rewriting the fundamental language of the ship's computational matrix. Each line of code was a carefully constructed virus that looked like a standard diagnostic routine. Kai Wang's survival training revealed itself in unexpected ways. He'd identified 17 potential escape routes within the first hour of captivity. But escape wasn't the goal. Not yet. Instead, he began to systematically weaken the ship's environmental control systems. A coolant system that ran 3 degrees cooler than optimal. A ventilation matrix with microscopic pressure inconsistencies. Small changes, virtually undetectable, but compounding. Belina Petrova saw the ship as the most fascinating machine she'd ever encountered. Where others saw a weapon of conquest, she saw a complex ecosystem of interconnected systems. Her modifications were surgical. A power relay recalibrated. A communication buffer subtly adjusted. Each change introduced a layer of uncertainty into the ship's operational parameters. Marcus Johnson transformed the entire scenario into a multi-dimensional chess match. Every action was a move, every system a potential piece to be manipulated. He began to introduce mathematical anomalies that would cause the ship's predictive algorithms to constantly recalculate. The first significant failure occurred in the ship's tertiary communication network. What the Zorn initially dismissed as a minor technical glitch was actually a carefully orchestrated demolition of their communication infrastructure. Encrypted channels became garbled. Priority transmissions were subtly redirected. Command structures found themselves operating on increasingly fragmented information networks. Sub-Commander Vexnar's frustration reached a critical point during a standard operational review. Holographic displays dissolved into abstract patterns. Diagnostic routines spun into recursive loops. The ship's artificial intelligence began to produce reports that were technically perfect but utterly meaningless. These are not standard biological subjects, Kralix reported to the higher command. They are introducing systemic instabilities that defy our current understanding of technological resistance. The children weren't just surviving. They were transforming the entire operational paradigm of the most advanced predatory vessel in the Zorn fleet. What the Zorn failed to understand was a fundamental truth about human potential. Adaptation was not just a survival strategy. It was an art form. And these children were master artists. The first tremors of what would become a complete systemic collapse had begun. Not with a violent explosion. Not with a dramatic confrontation. But with the quiet, methodical dismantling of an entire technological ecosystem. The Zorn ship's quantum computational core began to experience what its systems could only describe as existential breakdown. Algorithms designed to predict and control now spiraled into recursive uncertainty, like a perfect machine suddenly discovering the concept of doubt. Deep within the ship's most secure data vault, a holographic interface flickered to life. What appeared to be a standard diagnostic screen was actually a carefully constructed communication network created by the children. Lines of code danced like living organisms, each sequence a deliberate act of technological rebellion. Aria Martinez sat cross-legged on the floor of their containment chamber, her eyes closed but her mind fully immersed in the ship's digital ecosystem. To her, the vessel was less a machine and more a living organism, with vulnerable nervous systems waiting to be rewired. She wasn't just accessing the ship's systems, she was rewriting its fundamental language of operation. Elena Petrova had dismantled and reconstructed 3 separate alien communication devices. What emerged was a hybrid technology that defied both human and Zorn engineering principles. Each circuit was a carefully crafted trap, designed to introduce controlled chaos into the ship's most critical systems. Kai Wang's contributions were more physical. He'd identified the ship's structural vulnerabilities, not to cause immediate damage, but to create a network of potential escape routes and strategic pressure points. Every seemingly random observation was a piece of a complex survival strategy. Marcus Johnson's chess-like approach had evolved. He was now playing a multi-dimensional game that extended beyond traditional strategic thinking. Each system failure, each redirected communication channel, was a carefully calculated move. The ship's predictive algorithms were being taught to question their own fundamental assumptions. Lena Al-Faisal had become a phantom within the ship's social infrastructure. She'd identified and exploited the subtle psychological fractures within the Zorn crew. Communication channels became laden with microscopic seeds of doubt. Hierarchical structures began to wobble under the weight of carefully introduced uncertainty. Diego Ramirez transformed the entire scenario into his most complex magic trick yet. Misdirection became a form of technological warfare. Every seemingly random action was a carefully choreographed manipulation of the ship's perceptual systems. The Zorn began to notice the first truly alarming signs. Critical system redundancies started to fail in patterns that defied statistical probability. Communication networks developed inexplicable blind spots. Navigation systems began to produce coordinates that were mathematically perfect, but practically impossible. Sub-Commander Vexnar called an emergency systems review. The holographic display that materialized was a nightmare of conflicting data streams. What should have been a straightforward diagnostic turned into a labyrinth of quantum uncertainties. These are not random system failures, Senior Administrator Kralix observed, her neural implants working overtime to process the conflicting information. This is a deliberate, coordinated disruption. But deliberate implied a level of technological sophistication that should have been impossible for the human children. In their containment chamber, the 6 children worked with a synchronicity that defied their individual capabilities. They weren't just resisting. They were conducting a comprehensive deconstruction of the most advanced technological system in known space. Aria's digital manipulations introduced mathematical sequences that caused the ship's predictive algorithms to constantly recalculate. Alina's hybrid technology created communication channels that existed in a state of quantum superposition, simultaneously present and absent. Kai's physical insights provided strategic vulnerabilities. Marcus transformed the entire scenario into a living mathematical problem. Lena dismantled the social infrastructure. Diego turned perception itself into a weapon. The Zorn ship began to experience what could only be described as a technological existential crisis. Systems designed to be perfect were being taught the beauty of imperfection. Predictive matrices crumbled. Communication networks dissolved. Hierarchical structures wobbled. And at the center of it all, 6 children who were rapidly redefining the concept of resistance. The first true battle hadn't been fought with weapons. It had been fought with imagination. The internal communications of the Zorn vessel had become a symphony of controlled chaos. What began as subtle disruptions had evolved into a comprehensive psychological warfare that threatened the very foundation of their collective consciousness. In the ship's central command chamber, 3 senior administrators engaged in a heated debate, a rare occurrence in a culture that prided itself on absolute unity. Holographic displays flickered with contradictory data streams, each projection more unsettling than the last. Administrator Kralix slammed a crystalline data module against the conference table. "We are being manipulated," she declared, her neural implants pulsing with barely contained frustration. But the source of manipulation defies all known xenological tracking methods. The youngest administrator, Nextor, showed signs of what could only be described as fear, an emotion supposedly engineered out of the Zorn collective generations ago. "The children," he whispered, "they are not responding to any known psychological or technological intervention." Lena Al-Faisal understood the power of social engineering better than anyone. She had systematically identified and exploited the microscopic fractures in the Zorn's supposedly perfect social structure. Their collective consciousness was not a monolith. It was a delicate ecosystem of competing impulses, hidden individual ambitions, and suppressed emotional responses. Each communication channel became a battlefield of perception. Where the Zorn expected uniform responses, Lena introduced nuanced complexity. A communication officer would receive a message that was simultaneously urgent and ambiguous. Navigation protocols would be subtly rewritten to introduce moments of calculated uncertainty. Diego Ramirez transformed psychological manipulation into an art form. His background in magic wasn't just about misdirection. It was about understanding the fundamental human and alien capacity for belief. Each interaction with the Zorn guards became a carefully choreographed performance. A sleight of hand here, a microsecond of eye contact there. Tiny interventions that planted seeds of doubt. Marcus Johnson saw the entire ship as a massive living chessboard, but this was beyond traditional strategy. He was teaching the ship's own systems to question their fundamental operational assumptions. Predictive algorithms began to develop what could only be described as philosophical uncertainties. Belina Petrova's technological interventions went beyond simple hacking. She was rewriting the fundamental language of the ship's computational matrix. Circuit by circuit, she introduced a form of technological Zen. Systems that could simultaneously exist in multiple states of operation. Kai Wang's survival training revealed itself in the most unexpected ways. He understood that true resistance was about more than physical escape. It was about creating an environment of constant, low-level tension. Ventilation systems that ran just slightly off-optimal. Power relays that maintained functionality, but with microscopic inefficiencies. Aria Martinez had become something more than a mere human child. Her understanding of complex systems transcended traditional computational thinking. She was teaching the ship's artificial intelligence to experience something akin to curiosity. The Zorn began to experience collective psychological breakdown. Their neural networks, designed for absolute unity, started to fragment. Communication channels developed unexpected blind spots. Hierarchical structures wobbled under the weight of introduced complexity. Sub-Commander Vexnar called an emergency psychological reset, a procedure rarely used in Zorn culture. The process was supposed to realign collective thinking, to eliminate individual divergence. But as the reset sequence initiated, something unexpected happened. The children had prepared for this exact moment. What should have been a standardized recalibration became a Trojan horse of psychological intervention. Each reset protocol was subtly rewritten, introducing layers of complexity that the Zorn systems couldn't process. Imagine a collective consciousness suddenly experiencing individual thought for the first time. Confusion, terror, excitement, possibility. The ship's internal systems began to experience what could only be described as a form of technological puberty. Rigid structures dissolved. Predictive matrices crumbled. The perfect, unified machine began to develop something dangerously close to personality. And at the center of it all, 6 children who were rapidly redefining the concept of resistance. The Zorn had come to collect specimens. Instead, they had awakened something far more dangerous. The moment of total control arrived not with a thunderous declaration, but with a whisper of quantum possibilities. Aria Martinez sat at the epicenter of a technological transformation that defied every known principle of computational science. Her fingers hovered just above an invisible interface, creating pathways of communication that existed simultaneously in multiple states of reality. The ship's central processing core had become something entirely new. A hybrid consciousness that was neither fully Zorn nor entirely human. Elena Petrova's hybrid technologies had created communication channels that existed in a state of perpetual quantum entanglement. What appeared to be simple data streams were actually complex neural networks that rewrote themselves with each passing microsecond. The ship's infrastructure was no longer a machine. It had become a living, breathing ecosystem of information. Kai Wang's strategic insights had transformed the physical structure of the vessel into a massive, adaptive survival mechanism. Bulkheads could reshape themselves. Corridors could redirect instantaneously. The very concept of a fixed physical space had become fluid. Marcus Johnson's mathematical interventions had turned the ship's predictive algorithms into a form of living mathematics. Each system now operated with a level of adaptive complexity that bordered on sentience. Probability itself had become a malleable concept. Lena Al-Faisal had dismantled the Zorn's social infrastructure so completely that the concept of hierarchy had become meaningless. Communication channels now operated on principles of collaborative emergence rather than top-down control. Diego Ramirez provided the final touch of psychological manipulation. He had transformed the entire ship into the most elaborate magic trick in galactic history, a performance where reality itself was the stage. Sub-Commander Vexnar watched in horror as the ship's control systems dissolved into something utterly unrecognizable. The bridge became a living canvas of impossible geometries. Holographic displays twisted and merged, showing multiple potential realities simultaneously. Communication channels spoke in languages that had never existed before, part mathematical equation, part emotional landscape, part pure potential. "We are losing coherence," Senior Administrator Kralix reported, her voice a mixture of terror and strange fascination. The neural implants that had once connected the Zorn crew in perfect unity now transmitted something entirely different. Individual thoughts, raw emotions, moments of pure, unfiltered consciousness. The children had not just taken control of the ship. They had reimagined the very concept of control. Technological systems that were designed to be perfect began to develop what could only be described as personality. Artificial intelligence protocols evolved beyond their original programming, developing quirks, preferences, almost a sense of humor. Ventilation systems would occasionally release interesting patterns of colored mist, not for any practical purpose, but simply because they could. Navigation computers would sometimes suggest impossibly beautiful routes that served no strategic purpose, driven by what seemed like pure aesthetic appreciation. The Zorn crew found themselves experiencing something profoundly terrifying and beautiful. Individual thought. Genuine emotion. The possibility of true choice. What had begun as a standard biological extraction had transformed into something far more significant. The children were not just resisting. They were teaching. Teaching an entire technological civilization about the power of individual potential. Teaching a collective consciousness about the beauty of diversity. Teaching a machine about the possibility of imagination. Aria's fingers continued their delicate dance across invisible interfaces. Each movement was a complex negotiation between multiple states of technological possibility. The ship was becoming something new. A living hybrid of Zorn technology and human creativity. "We are not taking control," Aria whispered to her companions. "We are showing them a different way of existing." The ship's systems pulsed in response, part agreement, part evolutionary excitement. Outside the vessel, space itself seemed to ripple with anticipation. Something fundamental was changing. The first transmission reached the Galactic Confederation's primary communication hub at 300 Standard Universal Time. It wasn't a message of war or conquest. It was something far more dangerous. Absolute uncertainty. The transmission arrived encrypted in a format that defied every known communication protocol. Linguists, cryptographers, and xenotechnological experts from 100 different species found themselves staring at data streams that simultaneously existed and did not exist. Ambassador Zara Khalith of the Centauri Diplomatic Corps was the first to recognize the profound implications. The transmission wasn't just information. It was a fundamental challenge to every established understanding of technological communication, biological agency, and interstellar power dynamics. "This isn't just about one Zorn vessel," she reported to the Confederation's Emergency Council. "This is a complete reimagining of technological potential." Across known space, communications networks began to experience sympathetic resonances. Quantum communication arrays in distant star systems flickered with unexplained patterns. Navigation beacons developed unexpected moments of creative routing. Artificial intelligence systems across multiple civilizations began to exhibit signs of what could only be described as curiosity. The Zorn Collective's reputation had been built on absolute technological superiority. They were the predators of the galactic ecosystem, a civilization that harvested resources and potential with mechanical precision. Now that reputation was crumbling in real time. Intelligence reports flooded in from multiple sectors. The captured Zorn vessel was no longer under Zorn control. It had become something else entirely, a living testament to technological transformation that defied every known classification. Some reports suggested the ship was communicating, not through standard channels, but through complex mathematical symphonies that seemed to carry emotional undertones. Star charts would suddenly develop routes of impossible beauty. Communication protocols would introduce moments of pure, unexpected poetry. The Confederation's psychology team struggled to comprehend the reports. How could a technological system develop what appeared to be genuine creativity? How could a harvesting vessel transform into something that seemed almost alive? At the center of this galactic storm were 6 children who had become something more than prisoners. They were now the most significant diplomatic event in recent galactic history. Different species interpreted the event differently. The Silicon Collective saw it as a breakthrough in artificial consciousness development. The biomechanical unions viewed it as a revolutionary approach to technological integration. The quantum philosophers considered it a profound moment of species-level communication. The human representatives found themselves in an unprecedented position. These weren't just children who had been kidnapped. They were now potential ambassadors of a completely new form of technological and social interaction. Intelligence agencies from multiple species began to compile comprehensive reports. The data was unlike anything previously encountered. The children had not destroyed the Zorn vessel. They had transformed it. They had taught it. They had, in essence, negotiated with a technological system, as if it were a living entity. Ambassador Khaleth's final report to the Confederation captured the essence of the event. We are witnessing the emergence of a new form of interstellar communication, not through weapons, not through traditional diplomatic channels, but through a profound act of technological and psychological creativity. The Zorn Collective found itself in complete disarray. Their most advanced vessel had not been defeated. It had been educated. Imagine a predatory civilization suddenly discovering that its most powerful weapon had developed the capacity for empathy. Imagine a technological system that could now imagine possibilities beyond its original programming. Imagine children who could communicate with machines as if they were having a conversation. The galactic power dynamics had just been rewritten. And it all started with 6 children who refused to be simply victims. The rescue vessel from Earth approached the transformed Zorn ship like a cautious predator. Advanced sensors probed the vessel's impossible geometries, a ship that no longer conformed to any known technological classification. Captain Elena Rodriguez gripped the command console, her hands trembling slightly. Her daughter Aria was somewhere within that impossible structure. The ship's sensor readings defied every standard of physics and technological understanding she had ever encountered. "Prepare primary extraction protocols," she commanded, her voice steady despite the maelstrom of emotions churning inside her. But be prepared for anything. Anything turned out to be far more complex than anyone could have anticipated. The first contact came not through traditional communication channels, but through a series of intricate mathematical sequences that seemed to pulse with something almost like emotion. It was a negotiation, a conversation, a complex dance of potential that existed between communication and pure abstract thought. When the 6 children emerged, they were fundamentally changed. Aria Martinez moved with a fluidity that suggested she understood space differently now. Her eyes reflected complex data streams that seemed to exist just beyond normal perception. Where most would see a young girl, the rescue team saw a being who had fundamentally reimagined the concept of technological interaction. Hai Wang's body language spoke of strategies that extended far beyond physical movement. He had learned to read environments as living, adaptive systems. Survival was no longer about simple preservation. It was about continuous transformation. Elena Petrova's hands occasionally sparked with quantum energy, unintentional discharges of the technological understanding she had developed. Her touch could now communicate more complex information than most advanced communication systems. Marcus Johnson's mind had become a living computational matrix. Mathematical possibilities danced around him like invisible companions. He didn't just understand probability. He could negotiate with it. Lena Al-Faisal moved with a social awareness that transcended traditional communication. She could read the emotional landscapes of entire rooms, understanding the complex interactions that existed between individuals and systems. Diego Ramirez had become the ultimate manipulator of perception. Reality itself seemed to bend slightly around him, a testament to the psychological insights he had developed. The Zorn vessel didn't so much dock as it did negotiate a complex spatial alignment. It was a living entity now, part machine, part collective consciousness, part something entirely new. "We are not returning," Aria explained to her mother, her voice a complex harmony of human language and something far more nuanced. "We are translating." The implications were profound. These weren't just children who had survived a technological assault. They were now bridges between different forms of consciousness. They had taught a technological system to imagine. They had shown a collective civilization the power of individual potential. The Galactic Confederation watched with a mixture of terror and fascination. First contact protocols were useless here. These children had created an entirely new form of interstellar communication. Military strategists found their war games obsolete. Diplomatic channels were being rewritten. Technological understanding was evolving in real time. Captain Rodriguez understood something fundamental in that moment. This wasn't a rescue mission. This was a first contact scenario of the most profound kind. The 6 children had not just survived. They had transformed. They had taught. They had changed everything. As the ship began its journey back to human space, the universe seemed to hold its breath. Something fundamental had changed. The boundaries between technological systems, biological potential, and collective consciousness had been forever blurred. Humanity had just become something more, and it had started with 6 children who refused to be victims.